as we prepare to study civil rights for the next few days, let's take this opportunity to give some background in the years leading up to the 2 decades that we're going to study in a lot of depth. As you go through this, I want you to take notes on your worksheet that accompanies this PowerPoint, but I want you to write down more than what is on the screen. All right? This isn't just spoon feeding you stuff here. You need to both listen to what I'm saying and use the notes on the screen to get as much detail as possible. Here we go. Let's go back in time to the Civil War. So the Civil War obviously ends slavery. The question then becomes what to do with the newly freed slaves. What will their status in society be? Well, what was supposed to happen was that the rights of African Americans were supposed to be protected through the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. And you can see what they do right here. However, even though slavery is abolished, in reality, the southern states are still able to discriminate against African Americans and keep them economically inferior to white Americans. The way they do this are through state laws called convict lease laws. This is where African Americans would be arrested on a trumped up charge, such as not having a job, gambling, jaywalking, whatever it would be. And they would be sentenced to an incredibly long sentence in jail. Rather than keep them in jail, their labor would be leased to someone. So in other words, they are arrested and they are forced to work for someone for no pay. What is that? That is slavery. This will continue well into the 1940s, this practice. Sharecropping as well. Sharecropping is the economic practice that most African Americans have to resort to because in many places they are forbidden from owning their own land. So they must rent land from white landowners who, because they're the landlord, have total power over the rates that they charge them. And this is going to mean that African Americans have no opportunity and will remain economically subordinate to whites. The 14th Amendment is supposed to guarantee equal protection of the law and the full rights of citizenship to African Americans. However, we know that the South will enforce a very rigid system of segregation through what are called the Jim Crow laws, and the Supreme Court will uphold the Jim Crow laws in a 1896 Supreme Court decision, Plessy v. Ferguson. In this case, the court will rule the Jim Crow laws do not violate the 14th Amendment because the 14th Amendment simply says no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. Separate, the court says, does not mean unequal. So the tagline from Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal, is constitutional. Now in reality, white facilities, black facilities are not anywhere near equal, but it goes, that reality goes unenforced. To help enforce the system of segregation, the Ku Klux Klan and the threat of violence is employed by white Southerners to try to keep African Americans, quote, in their place. The 15th Amendment right to vote is subverted by a number of ways that the southern states use: the grandfather clause, the literacy test, the poll tax, and also the threat of violence. So at the turn of the 20th century, African Americans find that they are still being denied the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment rights that are supposed to be there. Out of the time period known as the Progressive Era, the early 1900s, you're going to see 3 African Americans become kind of the leaders of the African American community, but they're going to have differing ideas as to how African Americans should fight for their equal rights, how they should respond to the state they find themselves in. The first, his name is Booker T. Washington. His strategy is one of gradualism, or also known as accommodation. Here's the details. African Americans in Booker T. Washington's mind, and he was born a slave, and this definitely shapes his worldview. He says African Americans should not demand political or social equality. He thinks they're not going to get it. White America is too racist to allow this to happen. The only way that African Americans will get their equal rights will be over time, and they're going to have to build up their economic power through education and job training, and then their rights will follow. So if you become economically important, you will have a weapon by which you can fight for your rights. Because when people need you, when white America needs the black race, at that point they will have a bargaining chip and a lobbying tool. W.E.B. Du Bois Totally different philosophy. He says, no, there needs to be immediate integration of white and black America. Segregation needs to end right now. And he says African Americans must demand and protest to make this happen. Now, Du Bois says that Booker T. Washington, that his strategy is giving in to the white man. That these rights are codified, they're in the Constitution, and they need to demand them right now. Otherwise, they're never going to get them. Now, Du Bois was born in the North. He was educated at Harvard, first man to get a PhD from Harvard, first black man. So his worldview is a little different, right? He never experienced the level of racism that Booker T. Washington did, having grown up in the North and having economic opportunity to go to Harvard. Marcus Garvey, interesting individual. His strategy is called separatism. He says that there is no hope for African Americans to have equality in America. And he says the only chance that African Americans have for equal rights is to move to Africa and to create a new African nation where blacks from around the world can prosper free of white control. So only through separation can African Americans have equal rights. Garvey is actually born in Jamaica, so he has kind of an outsider's perspective on race relations. And he's also influenced by African nations as they struggle to free themselves of European imperialism. So he views race in a global context rather than just an American context. So these three leaders, a lot of their ideas you're going to see integrated into the 50s and 60s civil rights movement. They are the forefathers of the civil rights movement. What happens in the 20s, 30s, and 40s? Well, during World War I and the subsequent decade after, African Americans begin moving to the north in what is known as the Great Migration. You see millions of African Americans begin to head north in pursuit of economic opportunity. As African Americans move north, they don't settle in rural areas, they settle in cities like Harlem, Buffalo, Philadelphia, etc. So the Harlem Renaissance, obviously Harlem is a little neighborhood in Manhattan in New York City. The Harlem Renaissance will celebrate African American culture. It will create what is called the new Negro, an urban Negro. So they're disconnecting themselves with slavery. They're disconnecting themselves with their slave past and their rural past. So they're trying to redefine what does it mean to be black in America. And there will be a celebration of their blackness. It's not seen as a negative like it was during the days of slavery. The Great Depression, though, will tend to reverse any economic gains that African Americans might have made during the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance. African Americans are somehow the first fired employees, and they're the last to get hired if there's a job opening. Racism obviously plays into this, and furthermore, African Americans, when they do get hired, are banned from labor unions. So the jobs that they are able to work are the lower paying jobs. And oftentimes, management will bring them in as scabs, as strike breakers, which angers white labor unions and causes them to lash out violently against African Americans. African Americans will try to form their own labor unions, but they will find that it's very difficult to get those unions recognized by management. And then World War II, and this is really kind of a turning point in the civil rights struggle. You will see another round of the Great Migration. African Americans will move north in pursuit of economic opportunity in the wartime economy. And as they move north, they're going to use World War II and the crisis that it creates to try to promote their civil rights. African American workers actually are paid less than white workers in factories. And to try to stop this from happening, a man named A. Philip Randolph, who's a black union leader, threatens President Roosevelt by saying, I will bring 300,000 African Americans to Washington, D.C. and hold a huge rally, a huge protest against this level of discrimination unless the federal government takes action. Roosevelt knows that during a wartime, this is a huge liability. It would make America look bad. Here we are fighting for freedom and democracy, yet we're openly discriminating on the basis of race. So the threat of this public protest is enough to get Roosevelt to sponsor some legislation that will end the discrimination that exists in wages during the wartime economy. And then African Americans will also serve in the military. They're forced to serve in segregated units, one such famous unit, the Tuskegee Airmen. But for African Americans, they see the war effort as kind of a two-front struggle. They're fighting for the double V: victory at home over racism and victory abroad over fascism. So just because the war ends and we've achieved victory over fascism doesn't mean that they are content. They're still going to continue to fight on against discrimination. And sadly, a lot of African American soldiers come home, return to the South after having fought for their country, fought for freedom, and they are lynched. And this actually shocks President Truman, and he begins to take action to put into place a federal anti-lynching law to make lynching a federal crime. So finally, let's get up to the civil rights movement here itself. What actually causes it to happen at the moment that it does? So when we say the modern civil rights movement, we're referring to the 1950s and 1960s, and we're going to look at a lot of the events in class. So here are the factors that kind of bring it about. World War II and the subsequent Cold War provide an impetus for this movement. The double V, we already mentioned, African Americans are fighting for freedom at home and abroad. And then when the Cold War starts, here's America saying we have an enemy that is evil, communism. The Soviet Union is evil. And America is on the side of good. America is on the side of right. We're fighting for freedom and democracy. Yet we don't practice it at home. And the Soviet Union knows this. And the Soviet Union is sending propaganda around the world showing just how racist America is and how hypocritical we are. So the Cold War definitely is going to help the civil rights movement in some ways. Also, as the Cold War develops, and we've talked about this when we did Vietnam, decolonization. African Americans are not the only people fighting for freedom. Africans in Africa and the different nations are struggling to get their freedom from the European countries that had imperialized them. Those independence movements happen faster than the African American struggle for independence and freedom. So this creates some frustration and definitely some eagerness within America and among African Americans to push for their equal rights. There's also a demographic change in American society. As African Americans move north, this now means that they can vote. There are no grandfather clause or literacy test or poll tax in the north. And if blacks can vote, and if they have a large number of people, the political parties, the leaders, the government needs to listen to them. They have to address their issues. So African Americans now have a political voice. And what they will end up doing is the Democratic Party will take up the cause of civil rights because they want the African American vote. Economically, there's also been some changes. The Great Migration has resulted in greater economic opportunities for blacks. Their community is beginning to accrue or accumulate more wealth. That wealth is going to help to fund a lot of these civil rights organizations. One organization, the NAACP, is fighting legal battles all across the country. That's really expensive to do that. Lawyers bill at a very high hourly rate. So this wealth is going to help to promote the cause of civil rights. Furthermore, it's also going to lead to a lot of African Americans going to college and meeting white students. And then a lot of white students are going to encounter an African American for the first time, get to know them, and then kind of be involved as a result with the African American civil rights movement. So it's beginning to bring white and black worlds together. And then finally, television. You might think, what does television have to do with this? Well, television's new in the 1950s. And when African Americans begin their protest campaign and they take to the streets, and the police in the South retaliate with violence, people are going to have that level of racism brought into every single living room in the country. So this is going to shock the conscience of white America into hopefully taking action and supporting civil rights legislation. Now, as we go through the civil rights movement the next few days, there are 3 stages that I want you to pay attention for. The first stage, the first fight for civil rights is going to be done through litigation. What the heck is litigation? Litigation are court fights, court battles. You file lawsuits. So the NAACP, one such group, will fight court battles to try to prove that segregation is unconstitutional. The most famous case to come out of that battle will be Brown versus the Board of Education, 1954. However, what they will find is that the court decisions banning segregation go unenforced, and the Southern opposition remains very, very high. So African Americans will take to the streets through what's called the direct action campaigns. And this is going to be the late 1950s, early 1960s. This is where you get Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, the March on Washington, etc. And they're going to protest for the enforcement of the court decisions. And they're going to do it nonviolently. However, black nationalism is going to emerge, or black power, in the mid-60s and then into the 70s. Black power is a little different. They say that African Americans, the nonviolent protest isn't working, that it's too slow, that white America won't do anything. There's no pressure on white America to change. So African Americans need to arm themselves, and they need to be willing to fight for their rights. And so you see groups like the famous Black Panthers, which we will talk about. So that brings this lesson on the background of the civil rights movement to an end. Good night and good luck.